the image of the Rohtang tunnel, and I had just come back from fieldwork on the finished tunnel, and I've also visited it earlier when it was under construction. So what I will be talking about today is is the recent turn in my work, not well recent in the sense that couple of years back, on also looking at the tunnel. But for the longest time, I've been looking at roads, and I've titled my presentation Roads, Tunnels and Bridges, Exploring Intersections of Infrastructure and Society. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so basically this trajectory in my work, I'm drawing on the recent, again, infrastructural turn in the social sciences. And for the most part, infrastructures have been kind of studied by anthropologists, but geographers have also been very active in understanding infrastructures in several ways. And I draw upon, for example, Ashameen's work, who talks about how infrastructures, material infrastructures, allow us for a new genre of thinking that narrates social life. I also am quite interested in Brian Larkin's work, his essay on the poetics and politics of infrastructures, and where he's looking at infrastructures not in any positivist sense as mere backdrops or silent witnesses to our social life, but as defining aspects of how we live our life, and some of this will become clear when I begin to illustrate with my story of the roads. And Nikhil Anand's work also, for example, looks at how infrastructures become assemblages through which, let's say, governance can happen, through which states kind of reach out. And in my work, I talk about how roads basically claim territory and in some ways make the nation. So again, looking at the connection between social and cultural with an understanding of infrastructures. And here infrastructures, just like many anthropologists and geographers before me, I'm looking at infrastructures not as mere artifacts, but as assemblages of many, many things, as those that bring together, wires and people and material and ideas, theories. A lot of that comes together through infrastructures. So we inform infrastructures in many ways, and infrastructures inform our life in many ways. That's the kind of connection that I'm looking at in my work. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. I'm also trained as a feminist geographer. My PhD, I had Penn State allowed me the opportunity to do a dual PhD, one in geography and one in women's studies. So my work lies at this very interesting, vibrant, I feel kind of quite a fascinating discipline called feminist geography. And feminist geographers have, for the most part, sought to understand how power works and to dismantle all hierarchies, working towards a more just world. Yeah, is there? Sorry, okay. I thought there was a question. And how we have been doing it is, one, looking at connections between the material and the symbolic, just which I was also referring to in terms of what infrastructure studies is also doing. So there's a lot of interesting overlap in that sense. In fact, one of the early scholars of this turn comes from STS, Susan Lace Starr, and she's also a feminist scholar. When she urges us and pushes us to look at infrastructures as those with symbolic meanings, and those that are as much like agents and participants as with us in terms of making meaning out of space or place making. I'm also interested in looking at the temporal and rhythmic analysis of how infrastructures are used. In my work, you will also see how the temporal and rhythmic analysis of how infrastructures are built, because I largely look at the labor of constructing infrastructures. Um, Very important, I argue, is to pay attention to what visible infrastructure conceals, what it enables, and what it denies. Again, taking an example of a road, we would see a glossy, tarred road winding up and down the mountains. But that tells a very interesting subterranean and a subaltern story of how rock was broken, how how they had to use dynamite, how layers of geology form the underground of that particular road, how rubble was thrown into the stream and perhaps altered some bit of the course, how migrant laborers came from all the way from Jharkhand or Nepal and their ideas and how that intersects. So, it's a simple road, but it is really kind of part of many stories. And also in terms of who has access to it, who is denied entry. The same road might have, and to my students, I often give the example of, let's say, the flyovers that came up near Panipat or like in the Delhi-Chandigarh highway. I live close to Chandigarh. Panipat, Karnal, Kurukshetra, these are very significant towns and also very connected to a global and a national economy. But with the flyovers that bypassed these cities in with the like the widening of National Highway number 1, and you suddenly they become disconnected, right? They kind of become bypassed, literally bypassed. Not just bypass in terms of traffic. So it's a road really kind of plays a large role in how social life is structured. Um, Lastly, in terms of my theoretical placement, as a feminist geographer, it's very important for me to pay kind of an attention to scale, and not just the scale in terms of when we understand scale as national, global, regional, but also the more embodied or the intimate scales of the body, and how these are not. So there's the more the how the notion of scales as nested in terms of the local being smaller than the regional or the national has like long been challenged now, perhaps for 2 decades, amongst scholars, and each one in fact embeds the other. One example of this is Sarah Smith's work in Ladakh, where she talks about women's bodies as sites through which a larger regional geopolitics plays out, when the tensions between the Buddhist and the Muslim groups in Ladakh urge women of their community to either have more children or whom to marry, or whose community can they reproduce. And so the bodies themselves become territories for division between these two communities that have traditionally been quite integrated, in terms of in the same family you will find Muslims and Buddhists in just 1 or 2 generations back. So the idea of looking at the body, what it experiences, what are the affective or the emotional dimensions of, in my case, infrastructures, is quite integral to my work. If we can go to the next slide now. All right. So, like I said, I look at roads, and roads have had a huge role to play historically in terms of claiming territory, and what in terms of looking at also building connections, but also claiming space. So, for example, the poster on the left, painted onto the shutter of a shop, is from an advertisement of the National Highway Authority of India, and it says, "Not just roads, building a nation." So immediately there's a symbolic leap, right, that has happened in that sense. The painting on this wall in Ladakh on Border Roads Organization says BRO in the service of the nation. I mean, they're an engineering contractual company. Yes, they're under the Ministry of Defense, but very interestingly, you see, right, there is a leap about how infrastructures are. Their logo, like on the website, it is about creating, connecting, and caring for the nation. So there are a lot of interesting symbolic allusions to how they place their work, which to any lay person might appear like a very mundane, breaking the rock and laying the tar and all of that. Very briefly, I want to mention, I mean, roads and streets have also been sites for very gendered experiences. And for example, women's access to public space and streets has long been something that feminists have been fighting for. And then the last image that I have on this slide is obviously a very gendered image of how infrastructures largely remain the domain of the masculine. A large part, especially these roads, are also considered ways through which we conquer Mother Nature. So again, there is a gendered illusion to the idea of a road. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the methodology that I've been using for my work is ethnography, and I call it ethnography. Basically, as all of you are aware, involves participant observation, which basically comes from a deep immersion in the field site. And traditionally, anthropologists, this is a method that anthropologists have used, but a lot of geographers have now found it a very, very useful method to look at, to understand the more minute or embodied or experienced aspects of people's lives. And my work has kind of challenged in some ways the very some of the static assumptions or practices of ethnography, because ethnography, if it requires deep immersion in a context, my context is has been for several years, from 2011 to 2017. It was largely these road construction laborers who migrate from either Nepal or Jharkhand. So I've been following them around in their journeys and staying with them around, well, not exactly with them, but around them in road construction sites in the upper Himalayas. So there is not, and the road construction sites also keep moving along the road, right? You build these 200 meters of road and you move to the next one. So it has in some ways not been deep immersion in one site. It has been deep immersion in the process of road construction. And therefore it's what I call it is a very mobile ethnography of infrastructure. It's something that where circulation and movement has been inherent. Also, I've been documenting some of this on my blog, migrantlaborers.wordpress.com, even though I haven't updated it in a while. Also, my most recent field trip was like just before, in fact, 2 weeks back, I came back from Lahore, looking at the Rohtang tunnel. And towards the end of this talk, I'll give you, I'll share with you some thoughts on what I observed during this visit, although there still hasn't enough time hasn't passed for me to process many of those observations. And I wasn't able to go in the past few years. I was on a Fulbright in the US for about a year, and then the pandemic. So fieldwork got disrupted for about a few years in the middle, and then my most recent one has been this 2021 one where so for the most times I have usually the summers I spent in the upper Himalayas on road construction sites. Whereas in the winter, I went to Jharkhand, where a large majority of the laborers that I interviewed were from. So to see how, how a road up in the Himalayas has connections to like remote places elsewhere in the country, and how ideas are circulating along with these roads, how people's lives are altered in the process of constructing these roads. So these are some of the things that I tried to understand through what I call a mobile ethnography of infrastructure. Also, each year that I've gone for field work, I've never gone alone for field work, except for this time around. I went. It was just me, but then I had somebody from Lahore, Kesang Thakur, who accompanied me to the higher reaches. And so again, there were two of us, and this time the flavor was also quite interesting because she was local Lahori, and we were trying to understand how Lahore has changed with the coming of the tunnel, or what are the kind of social, economic, cultural, political transformations that are happening because of the opening of the tunnel. But previously also, every time I've gone, the group has been different. So I have had some, IISER used to have these summer interns that we used to fund and train in the summer. That program unfortunately is no longer there. So there was to be summer interns, and then my own PhD students in the initial years. This would be their training within ethnography, in the discipline of ethnography. When at a time when my children were young, even they accompanied me, and I couldn't leave them elsewhere. So in the middle picture, you see my son trying to learn how to break a rock. And so, but each year I went, because I went with a different group, the flavor of the ethnography was very different. And I think that's very important to understand in terms of when we talk about objective research. Yes, this research is rigorous, but I will not call it objective, and I don't want to also. This is a project driven by the political urgency that I feel of bringing to light the hard work and the precarious condition of those that build the roads that we work on. And in a large in and it is my way of telling the story. This is not an objective way of telling the story. It is my way of telling the story. And I think that that creativity and that subjectivity is very important to retain, at least for me, in my own work. And ethnography has allowed me the tools to do that. Yeah, so these are the roads and the rails that we have traversed.